Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Commodore Room. I've been working on a lot of SX-64s lately, and I thought this would be a good one to make a video about. This belongs to a friend of mine named Randy, who actually has a podcast around retro and vintage computing, and I'll put the link to that podcast below. This one has a neat story. It actually came from a fella who had a barn full of old computers, and this is one that Randy was able to get his hands on. So it's actually a barn find computer, which is not something you see a lot. We're going to go ahead. It's in really good shape. Looks very nice. It's even got the end caps on it, which is somewhat uncommon with a lot of these. But we're going to go ahead and fire this thing up and see what it does. Okay, we've got it turned on, and this is what we see on the screen. A big bunch of nothing. And truth be told, I actually knew this is what it did when Randy had found this in the barn. Before we fired it up, I actually took the cover off, and it looked like some mice had had a nest on top of it someplace. So if I had to wager, it was up here. There was something had been up here and dropped a lot of things down inside. So he cleaned it out real good and fired it up, and this is basically what he was getting here. So we're going to figure out what's wrong with this thing. Just for fun, let's go ahead and test out the disk drive. And so the way we're going to do that is I'm going to fire it up, and we're going to see if this light comes on or not. That way we know that the disk drive is getting power, the CPU is getting the ROM routine, which will shut the drive light off. So it looks like at least the disk drive is working, the power supply is working, and obviously this guy right here, we're not getting anything. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to plug it into an external monitor and see what it does. Alright, so we've got the external monitor. The SX-64 will mirror its display, and that's the only thing it can do. It can mirror its display from the little tiny CRT to an external monitor. So you can see it got some sort of signal, and there's nothing there. So it's probably not the CRT in the 64, at least not yet, because we're not seeing anything externally either. So if the VIC chip and everything was working good, we would probably see something on the screen here if the CRT itself was bad. So let's go ahead and crack the case. Okay, we've got the top off, and looking at the inside, there is definitely still some remnants of whatever nest was on the cover of this thing. And let me zoom in here and I'll show you guys. So you can see down in there, there is still a fair amount of crap, that's a technical term, that's on the disk drive. I'm pretty sure that disk drive is going to have a hard time working just based on what I can see here. And let me move this camera and give you a little bit better view. Okay, you can kind of see down in here all the crud right through here, down in there, especially over in here. So there's still a lot of debris from the nest. The disk drive, as I mentioned before, probably not going to work. It looks like on the rails down inside there's a lot of crud. So we're going to have to take all this stuff apart to get to that disk drive and make sure it's cleaned up and everything slides on the rails good. So we're going to start by doing that. We're going to take some of this stuff apart because we know we're going to have to do that anyhow, and then we'll see what we see. So I moved that. You can see there's a lot of droppings, and I'm going to guess it's mouse pee. That's just a guess on my part. Probably right. I'm not an expert at it, but that's what it looks like to me. And a little bit of rust over here. Whatever got in here must have got over here as well. So we're going to go ahead and continue taking this glove box apart. So we're going to go ahead, take this glove box apart so we can get these wires and whatnot kind of cleaned up on this disk drive. So there's our disk drive. Not actually as dirty as I expected it to be, but most definitely there are droppings and things on the drive rails, so you may or may not be able to see it. Let's see if we get you zoomed in here. So this is the little shuttle, this black thing that the head is on. Looks to me it's definitely got some droppings on it, and then back in there, although a little hard to see, the drive rails, and there's some junk on that too. Not going to totally disassemble this. Sometimes that's a pain in the butt, although I've done it before and it does work. It's just, as I said, it's a pain in the butt. So we're going to go ahead and disconnect this drive, move it out of the way. The computer should still work without the disk drive in there. It doesn't need the disk drive, and it's very much like a stock 64 bread bin and a external 1541. They can run basically independently of each other if they need to. So I'm going to go ahead and trace this wire bundle down, disconnect it, and just kind of get it out of the way. But we're going to have to clean this, which is what I expected, which is why we took it apart. And for these lucky occasions when we have to play with computers with a lot of questionable materials on there, I've got rubber gloves because I'm not going to touch whatever that stuff is. Okay, after shaking that over the trash can because it was gross, I set the disk drive aside. So now we have a little bit more access to the inside of the SX-64 to figure out what's going on with it. The next thing we're probably going to do is take this back panel. This back panel is the power supply. We're going to take it, unscrew it. We're going to take it and unscrew it and kind of pull it out of the way so we get a better access to the board. It will move out a little bit. It doesn't move out a ton, but it will move out enough for us to do a little something with it. Okay, we've got the power supply moved back out of the way. So basically what you're looking at, this is the power supply. It's also like, I think of it as like a port extender. This is the I/O card. This is the CPU card for the 64, and this is basically the disk controller card. So I looked on this disk controller. I don't see anything wrong, but I also didn't expect to because I know the CPU is working because the light came on the disk drive and then it went off after a couple seconds. That's the CPU reading the ROM, executing the power on self-test, and then shutting the motor off. So still could be a lot of problems with it, but at least the CPU is doing what I believe it should be doing on this guy. Our problem with the video could very likely be here, and so let's focus some of our attention on the CPU card. I don't see anything blatantly obvious, like a blown capacitor. A blown capacitor, if it's electrolytic, then it'll kind of blow the little can off and paper and all the stuff goes everywhere, and that's no good. Other type of capacitors, they just usually burn. Not seeing that. But what I do see, at least right off the bat, is this right here. Let's zoom in on that. So that's an EEPROM. The little sticker on the window has fallen off. That could damage the EEPROM, erase the programming. If enough light got in there of the right wavelength, it could cause those to not function anymore. Don't know that that's what's happening here. Not suggesting that it is, but that is certainly a possibility. So that's the only thing I really notice just from a quick inspection. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this little zip tie, free these wires up a little bit so I can kind of move things around. Okay, so this wire right here is video. This basically is the monitor output from the back to the from the back of the Commodore 64, a bread bin that would you'd plug the monitor into. So this is basically just a jumper that's going to the back, so we can do the same thing. Easy to take this off. Don't need it for what we're doing right now. Okay. This right here, this is the video that goes to the built-in CRT, which is back over here, that way. And so we're going to leave that on there for right now. It's definitely possible to pull the CPU card, this I/O card out, set them on the bench, power them up, and see what's going on and get better access to the chips and stuff, kind of like you would do on a regular 64. So, and we may get to that point. I want to do a couple quick checks just to see what's going on. We'll throw the scope on this thing, see if the CPU is taking over, a couple things like that, and maybe we'll get lucky and it'll be obvious, but probably not. Anytime you're working on something, it's always nice to have the schematics. So I printed this guy out a while back. As I mentioned, I've been working on a lot of these. So let's go ahead and pull up the page with the CPU card. Since it's kind of hard to get down in there and see, we'll get an idea where the chips are at, and we'll figure out what's going on with this thing. Alright, so our CPU is down there on the bottom, which of course is the hardest one to get to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the probe on the clock, make sure we got the clock ticking over, then we'll put it on the address bus. The CPU should be putting addresses on the address bus, and if it looks good there, we'll put it on the data bus. So we're going to go ahead and get the scope hooked up. I don't have to go right at the chip, I just need to be able to get to those pins somewhere. And so we'll go ahead and get a few probes on here and see what we got. Alright, so I've got the scope hooked up, and although it's like super overkill to use a scope to measure voltage, we're going to do that since I've got it hooked up. And we're getting a nice clean 5 volts. so that looks pretty good. So I don't believe we have power supply issues. That certainly doesn't rule it out, but at least this part's looking good. So let's go ahead and let's probe the clock and see if this thing is ticking over, or since it's going to be easier, we'll go ahead and hit the address of the data bus since that's already on this chip. That'll be a quicker test. And let's just see what we got there. Okay, so I've got the probe hooked up to address bit 7, or address line 7. So I went ahead and got it frozen here. You can see ones and zeros coming across that address bus. So it's very likely the CPU is doing some stuff. It's not, I mean, we have no real way to know with this tool what exactly all that means, but it's definitely throwing things on the address bus. So that's a good sign that the CPU is doing some stuff. Overall, that's kind of what we expect. So let's look at the VIC chip. So based on the fact that we're seeing activity on the address bus and the data bus, it seems the CPU is working. So the fact that we're not getting video could be the VIC chip, sorry, or it could be a CIA chip, although I'm less inclined to think that at this point, or the PLA. So I think the best move is to pull these boards out so we can get to them a little bit easier, because we may have to do a bit more testing. And let's start with the VIC chip. That seems to be the most likely, at least right now, but it'll be easy to test those out. So we'll test the VIC. If that doesn't work, we'll go ahead and try the PLA, and then we'll go from there. But first things first, let's get these boards out of here so we can actually work on this thing. One thing kind of neat with the SX-64 is the boards are held in place with these little black, I guess I would kind of call them rivets, maybe. And so I'll get one out here and show you what they look like. So basically that little black guy right there slides in the hole. You push this pin in and it spreads it out, as you can see there, and that kind of holds it in. Sort of a neat way to fasten the boards without having any additional metal in the case. I think the best place to start with this one is going to be the VIC chip. It's likely that's what's wrong with it. We'll do a little swap on this guy real quick and just see if that makes anything better. I'll pull a working VIC chip from the stockpile over here and we'll see what happens. Okay, here's the VIC pulled out of the SX. And so the conductive paste was powder, so I don't know how good the heatsink was working. Obviously it's going to work pretty well, but with the paste on there it's certainly going to work better, so we'll do something with that when we put it back. But I'm going to go ahead and replace this one with another one that we know works. Okay, we've got the power supply plugged into the board. Down here I've got the video from the board going out to the external jack so we can see it on the external monitor. And that should be it. Let's see what happens. As you can see, we're getting a big bunch of nothing. So certainly still could be a bad VIC chip, but there also could be some other things going on. So time for a little bit more troubleshooting. Since my first guess of the VIC didn't fix it, the next guess, and probably should have been the first guess, is the PLA. PLA is sort of like glue logic, if you will. What I'm going to do is go ahead and pop a new PLA in here. However, what I did notice is this little capacitor right here looks like it's broken. I certainly could have done it when I was pulling the chip out, although I don't think so. Or maybe somebody's had this apart before, or something. I don't know. I'm going to go ahead and put a little piece of solder, connect that capacitor back up, put a new PLA in there, and let's see what it does. So we've got the PLA replaced. We went ahead and put everything back together, and let's see what happens. Well, now look at that. That's definitely a plus. So it looks like at least the PLA was bad. On these machines, I know, and I'd have to look this up on the net, but I'm pretty sure the PLAs run pretty hot and probably should have had a heat sink on it. So I'll show you what I put in it to fix that problem. This is a modern PLA recreation, if you will, so it won't run anywhere near as hot. So I'm going to go ahead and pop back in the original VIC, make sure that that is good, and at least this part is done. Now the million-dollar question with the SX-64 is, does this CRT work? So I've went ahead and wired it up, and let's see if it runs. Okay, the external monitor is showing something. Okay, so the internal monitor works, which is good. We're seeing some funky colors. Let's see if we can adjust that. We're getting the flashing cursor. Got good, or at least correct color. Doesn't look too distorted, so that's good. And if you've ever used one of these, this screen is not exactly the best screen in the world. It's kind of hard to read, and especially the older you get and the more glasses that you need, the harder it becomes to use this thing. But still very cool. I still like it, and so far, so good. We don't know if the CIA chips work. We don't know if the disk drive works. We don't know if the keyboard's any good. Those are notorious to fail based on that membrane that's in there. We don't know if the SID chip works, but at least we're getting this far, and that's huge. So this is the PLA that I've used. I find these things on the internet, and I pretty much buy every one of them just to see how well they work and whatnot. So this is one I picked up someplace. I'll put a link in the description below if I can remember where I got it from, although it probably says on that chip. But there it is. That's the one we popped in that seemed to have solved the problem. Okay, here we got the new VIC chip in place with the heat sink back on it with a nice serving of new thermal grease. I would show you the video of that, but it took me an embarrassingly long amount of time to get that thing back on there, so we're just going to skip to the part where we turn it on and see if it works. So there we go. I'm glad to see the original VIC works, because the last thing I wanted to do was try to get that thing off again, get thermal grease all over the place and all over me. And so yeah, I'm super happy. I wish we would have just replaced the PLA first, but you know, sometimes you make things harder than it needs to be. Now that we've got the system working, it's probably as good a time as any to do something about all this stuff on the inside. So I'm going to get a shop vac. I'm going to vacuum this dude out and see what else we can do to get it cleaned up. As I'm taking this apart, I'm finding a lot of debris and rust. So I think the best move at this point is to take every little piece apart, take some Clorox wipes, wipe it all down so it's nice and clean and safe, and then get a wire brush and really get all this rust off of this chassis, and then maybe repaint the parts so that the rust is gone and no longer an issue. Rust is not a great conductor of electricity, but it does still conduct electricity. So if it were to flake off and get between a couple pins on a chip or something, it could short things out, and we just can't have that. When it comes to taking off the top and bottom plastic pieces that are attached to the case, you have to be very careful. I would call these little circular black clips one-way type clips. They sort of eat into the plastic, if you will, or bite into the plastic, which makes them very hard to get off. So what you're seeing here is the best way that I found to get them off. And the only reason I'm taking them off is because it's pretty gross underneath these. I can see droppings and leaves and all sorts of other things under the plastic here. So I really want to get them off. So what I'm going to do is push my thumb or a finger on top so that I'm not, as I'm sort of pulling up on the clip, I'm not pulling up on the plastic. This plastic is old. It will break pretty easily. And so I'm taking my time here using these spudging tools, and it works. It just takes time, and sometimes the clips get a little bent out of shape, and you have to bend them back. As you can see here, I'm taking all the plastic pieces and going over them pretty thoroughly. So I'm using a light bleach mix to wipe them down. I'm using Clorox wipes in some cases, other cases choose using the rag. I'm also using a toothpick to get all the big pieces of grime out. And then finally, when I'm all done with that, I'm going to take them to the sink, use some 409 and a toothbrush, and give it a good scrubbing. When this is done, it should look very clean and certainly not like new, but as like new as it's going to get. So it takes a little bit of time, but it's worth the effort. The handle on the SX-64 is usually one of the dirtier things. Certainly the heat sink on the bottom where you set them down can get pretty grimy, but the handles can get very grimy as well. So I'm going to go ahead and clean those with a toothpick and then take it to the sink with a toothbrush, just like the other parts. And then finally, where the blue caps snap on either side of the handle, there's basically double-sided foam tape. So I'm going to scrape that off using a plastic spudger and then an alcohol prep to basically slowly scrape it off with my fingernail. It does take some time, but once that's all off, I'll be able to reattach it and it'll look good as new. What you're seeing here is some of the rust after I got the computer all disassembled. So as you can see, it's a bit deep, And so what I did was I took a wire brush and scrubbed this until all the rust was gone, which took some time. And then, as you can see here, I painted it with some Rust-Oleum to prevent any future rust growth, at least in this area. And it actually came out pretty good. There was actually some rust on the bottom, which I didn't notice before, but as I was checking my work, I discovered that and redid that as well. So I think we're going to be in good shape. I don't believe there's going to be any more rust flakes coming off of this one. Here you see the power supply. I was planning on just cleaning the base up a little bit and putting it back together, but then I noticed there was a lot of bugs and leaves and stuff inside of it. So I ended up taking it apart, taking it to the sink, doing the toothbrush water thing, letting it dry real good, and putting it back together. Important tidbits: there were a lot of bugs in this thing, way more than I would have expected. The other, probably more important tidbit is the power supply base. This brown piece here that the power supply sits inside of is actually a heat sink. And so there is thermal grease between the power supply itself and the heat sink. And so that is to allow better conduction of heat from the power supply to the heat sink. And you see all the fins on this power supply, the little ridges, if you will. That's for convection. So it gives it more surface area, so more air can carry away that heat. So I want to try not to get the thermal grease all over myself this time and get this thing put back together. Well, now that we've got all of the grime cleaned off of this thing, it's time to start putting everything back together. This is going to take a little bit of time, and I'll point out anything interesting as I'm going along here. But everything is clean and much less gross. So this will be a lot nicer to work on as we finish this thing up. Okay, one thing I ran into with this one, and I've ran into this on a couple others, is when we pull off that little brown plastic plate on the other side and pull these clips off, the clips don't fit back down on as tight as they used to. I've looked for these clips. I haven't been able to find any. Maybe somebody watching has a better idea, and if so, leave me a message because I'm curious where I can get them. So what I do is I push them back on like you see here, and I put a little shim of plastic underneath it. I'll zoom in on this and give you an idea. So I put a little shim of plastic underneath it, and it's just a touch of glue between the plastic and this little clip. Easy to remove if you don't want it, or if there's a better solution, you can just pull those right off. But that keeps that brown plastic piece that's underneath snug up against the case, keeps them from bouncing around and everything. So in this one, I actually put 2 pieces of plastic as a shim. I folded it there, and the other one here, this one here is just one. It only needed 1 sheet of plastic. And so this is just a report cover. I trimmed it, trimmed the little pieces of plastic off. And those work really, really well. I've done this on a couple other ones. Keeps it on there nice and smooth. Ideally, you wouldn't have to take this plastic piece off, but with all the debris and mouse pee and everything else that was underneath it, it really needed to be clean because it was pretty disgusting. But anyway, yeah, if anybody knows where to get these clips, let me know. Now that we got the gross case all cleaned up, let's see if the keyboard works. So I've got the new power supply, or the cleaned power supply, hooked up, and let's see what happens with the keyboard. So you can probably hear me touching keys, and then you don't see much happening on the screen. So this keyboard membrane is shot. Not unusual, as that's a pretty common failure point with this. So we're going to have to take this apart and put a new keyboard membrane in it. I've played around with repairing these things. Doesn't go well, and it's time consuming, and I haven't figured out a good way to repair them. But buying a new membrane for 20 or 25 bucks, that works pretty well. So we're going to do that. As I'm taking this apart, you can see how dirty my fingers are. This membrane is really old and is just disintegrated. And you'll see here in just a minute, as I get this thing disassembled, that this membrane is really stuck to the board, and it's just really hard to get off. So I'm going to do a lot of cleaning on this circuit board to get all the residue of this membrane off so that our new one will actually have a chance of working correctly. I've cleaned the circuit board really good with some IPA. I've also cleaned each key individually with some IPA, and now I've got the new membrane on. So now really this is the fun part, and that's putting all the keys back on, and then we'll test this dude out. Here we have the keyboard plugged in with the new membrane. And it looks like it works. One thing I noticed using the diagnostic cart on this machine was that the SID chip was dead. Nothing at all was working on it. And so what I'm trying here is just cleaning the contacts real good just to see if I can get lucky. I didn't. And so what I ended up doing was putting a SwinSID in this. I'll put a link to this device in the description below. But I ended up having to replace it because it was just completely dead. Our last piece of work on this SX-64 is this disk drive. As you can see, it's got a lot of crud in it. And I'll try to zoom in here. But there's a lot of, I don't know, mouse nest. You can see there's a lot of debris in there from whatever critters were living on top of this thing. I really don't want to take this thing completely apart. We'd have to realign it. That's kind of a pain. And if it works, which is a big if, then we just don't really need to. So if the head's bad, that might be enough right there. And I've never actually tried to replace the mechanism with one out of a straight 1541. I'm sure it works. The wiring harness may be a little bit different. I don't remember. So that might also be an option. But what I'm going to do, blow this thing out real good, and then we're going to see, once it's cleaned up, at least physically enough, does it actually function. So let's do that. I'm going to go take it outside, blow it out with the air compressor real good, try to wipe everything down as best I can with alcohol, and then let's see what it does. Alright, just blew this thing out with 120 pounds of air, and surprisingly not a lot came off. Big chunks of things certainly did, but there's a lot of things that didn't. Get in the cracks and crevices here as best I can. We'll clean the heads off, or head I should say. We'll clean the head off a little bit. You can see a little bit of the grime. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the drive outside the case, just kind of off to the side. All the wires will reach, everything should work okay. I can still get to my keyboard, which is important. And let's see what it does when we turn it on. Seems to work. At this point, we're just about done. We're going to get this disk drive put back inside. We're going to put the top part of the case on and get our handle reinstalled. So here we are, almost done. We've taken this thing completely apart. We've replaced the SID, the PLA, the keyboard membrane, cleaned all the mouse droppings off and the rust and pretty much everything else that was wrong with it. So it works really well. We played games on it. We'll do that here in just a minute. And really the last piece are these little end caps. So both of the end caps are there. Cleaned everything good. Got the handle back on. So I'm going to put some double-sided tape, which is how these were connected originally. I'm going to take some measurements. I'm going to cut the tape so it fits in there perfectly. And then we're going to slide those on. And then we're going to play a game. So it turns out double-sided tape is kind of hard to cut on the desk. So I'm just going to go ahead and put it over these ends and cut it here with a razor blade. As you can see, it's a little bit tedious, got to be a little bit careful. It doesn't look perfect, but when the end cap gets on there, it actually ends up looking pretty darn good. As you can see, we've got this computer working pretty well. We've got it all cleaned out and back from the dead and ready to play some fun games. If you find yourself in Indianapolis this April, please come by the Indy Classic Computer and Video Game Expo. Ought to be a lot of fun, April 29th and 30th. Hope to see you there. And finally, if you want, you can follow the Commodore Room on Instagram, where we post pictures of some things that we're working on that never actually make it to YouTube. I hope you had fun hanging out with us today, and I hope you'll come hang out in the Commodore room again real soon.